The war began without sirens. No bombs, no soldiers, no smoke. Only silence. And then, hunger. One morning, shelves were empty. A few days later, electricity flickered out. Then medicine disappeared, followed by jobs, followed by hope. There were no explosions, only the slow, quiet unraveling of daily life. That is how modern war works. Invisible, deliberate, and devastating. Sanctions, they called it. A word that sounds clean, administrative, almost bureaucratic. A word written in conference rooms thousands of miles away, spoken by men in suits who call it a peaceful tool of pressure. But in the streets where it lands, it feels like a siege. Economic warfare is the quiet art of breaking a nation without firing a single shot. It is the empire's most efficient weapon, cheap, deniable, and endless. It doesn't conquer cities, it collapses them from within. It doesn't burn homes, it empties them. It doesn't kill armies, it starves children. The architects of this system understand numbers far better than they understand faces. They know the weight of inflation, the geometry of scarcity. They can predict with chilling precision how long it will take for bread to triple in price, how many months before hospitals run out of essential supplies, how many winters a population can survive before it breaks. And when it happens, they don't call it suffering, they call it leverage. In the 21st century, the battlefield is global finance. Banks, corporations, and algorithms have replaced tanks and missiles. The very same institutions that build economies can also strangle them, simply by closing an account, freezing a transaction, or cutting off access to the global financial system. The modern empire learned long ago that control doesn't require occupation, it only requires dependency. Every nation that trades, borrows, or saves in the global system is already inside the fortress, and within that fortress, the gatekeepers decide who eats and who starves. It always begins with a justification, always moral, always righteous. We must punish aggression, we must defend democracy, we must stop the spread of weapons. But beneath the grand speeches lies an ancient truth. Power is measured not by who you fight, but by who depends on you to survive. When sanctions fall, they don't just hit governments, they hit the ground. They hit hospitals without fuel. They hit families without medicine. They hit mothers trading their last pieces of jewelry for a bag of flour. They hit children who learn, far too young, that hunger has no ideology. Still, the architects will insist, this is not war, this is policy. And perhaps that is the cruelest brilliance of economic warfare, its ability to disguise suffering as strategy, to turn morality into a mask for control. In one nation, cancer patients wait for drugs that are trapped by export restrictions. In another, farmers burn crops they can no longer sell. Markets crash, currencies vanish, and lifetime savings dissolve overnight. And somewhere in a boardroom in New York or London or Brussels, someone looks at a chart, nods and says, "The pressure is working." The empire has found the perfect weapon, one that kills slowly enough to avoid the headlines, one that can be denied when confronted, one that leaves no body to photograph, only statistics. Every new sanction regime becomes a laboratory. Data is gathered, effects are measured, and resilience is tested. Economists call this modeling, but what they are modeling is despair. For the architects, it's elegant. No soldiers die on their side, no coffins return home. But for those living under the sanction, the battlefield is every kitchen, every hospital, every cold night. And yet, in the language of politics, suffering always finds a justification. They brought this upon themselves. They must change their behavior. They must learn. The sentence always ends there, as if starvation could teach democracy, as if poverty could instruct morality. In truth, economic warfare is not about change. It's about obedience. It's a message to the entire world. We decide who gets to participate. We decide whose suffering is acceptable. We decide which pain remains invisible. And when the sanctioned nation finally bends, when it signs the agreement, opens its markets, or surrenders its resources, the architects call it a success. They never call it surrender. The machine of sanctions feeds itself. Each new crisis births a new list, a new target. Nations fall in and out of favor like actors in a global play, with scripts written by those who control the stage. Even allies fear the shadow of disapproval. They comply not because they agree, but because they must. One closed bank channel can cripple an entire economy. One signature from a foreign office can erase decades of progress. And so, the empire never needs to threaten, it only needs to remind. Behind every sanction lies an unspoken rule. If you want to survive, stay in line. But there is another side to this story, the silent rebellion. Nations once humbled by embargoes are beginning to build alternatives. New currencies, new alliances, new systems that operate beyond the empire's reach. They trade in the shadows, they barter in silence, they innovate under pressure. Sanctions meant to break them, sometimes teach them independence. History whispers that every empire creates its own resistance. The Romans called it revolt, the Soviets called it dissent. The modern empire calls it de-dollarization. Still, for every act of defiance, there are millions who cannot afford it. The grandmother choosing between food and medicine, the father who cannot find milk for his child, the student who leaves school to sell water on the street. They are the ones who pay the price for politics they never voted for. And so the question lingers. If war by bombs is murder, what is war by hunger? The architects avoid the question. They speak instead of efficiency, of measurable impact, of policy outcomes. The language of economics becomes the language of absolution. Charts replace conscience. Percentages replace pain. One diplomat once said, "Sanctions are a non-violent means of influence." But when you starve a population to shape its behavior, violence is not absent. It is simply disguised. And yet the empire persists in its belief that this is the moral way, because it doesn't have to see the faces, because distance still shields the conscience, because the system was built to make cruelty look clean. In time, even citizens of the empire grow numb. They see suffering on their screens, feel a moment of sympathy, and then move on. Empathy fades when the pain is far away. Sanctions work best when no one looks too closely. Meanwhile, global markets profit. Companies find loopholes, intermediaries thrive, and corruption blooms in the black market born of restriction. The rich adapt, the poor disappear. The empire calls it order. The victims call it survival. And as the decades pass, the machinery of economic war evolves. Algorithms track transactions. Artificial intelligence predicts defiance before it happens, and digital currencies become new tools of control. The battlefield expands, no longer just targeting nations, but individuals. A dissident, a journalist, a whistleblower, all can be isolated, cut off, erased from the financial world with the click of a button. Economic warfare has gone personal, and that is its final perfection. A war so subtle that its victims begin to blame themselves. But empires, no matter how invisible, carry the same fatal flaw, the belief that their control can last forever. Every sanction builds resentment, every restriction sows innovation, and every act of domination writes the script of its own undoing. Because hunger teaches, because suffering remembers, and memory once awakened cannot be sanctioned. One day, when the empire's currency loses its crown and new systems rise in quiet defiance, historians will look back and say, it wasn't the bombs that broke them, but the arrogance of believing they could own the world's hunger. Sanctions will fade, as all instruments of control eventually do. But the scars will remain in the countries that endured, and in the conscience of the civilization that watched it happen. Perhaps then, the architects will finally realize that true strength is not found in domination, but in restraint, that the price of control is always paid by the innocent, and that morality can never be enforced by starvation. Until then, the war continues, silent, systematic, unseen, and in kitchens lit by candlelight, in pharmacies with empty shelves, in markets where prices double overnight, humanity bears the cost of policy. The architects call it progress. History will call it cruelty. And the question will echo long after they are gone. How many lives must be broken to prove an idea right? Thanks for watching. If this conversation is important to you, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more content that looks beyond the headlines. Stay curious.